Hi, my name is Stephen Witmer, and I am a small town pastor in the town of Peripheral, Massachusetts, about an hour northwest of Boston, and just a few minutes from the Massachusetts-New Hampshire border. I've been in my town for 12 and a half years or so, and I delight in the vocation, in the calling of being a small town pastor. I want to share a bit about my story, my pilgrimage to becoming a pastor in this place. And of course, as with any of the stories we tell about our own lives, there are various themes that we can highlight, various ways to tease out all the many things that God does to get us to where He wants us. But I'd like to share in this telling of my story toward being a small town pastor, the influence of my father. My dad was a small town pastor. It might actually be more accurate to say he was a small towns pastor. One of the greatest reasons why I love my small town is because my dad loved his small towns, three of them at the same time. In September 1975, my parents moved from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, which at the time really was bustling and increasingly a tourist mecca, to remote and very rural Maine. And for the next 9 years, my dad pastored a 3-church parish. Each of those small churches was located in its own tiny village, and really he thought of himself and sometimes referred to himself as a circuit rider. He's kind of continuing that great tradition of circuit riders from 200 years previous, those men who had preached throughout the countryside in great circuits and ridden their horses hundreds of miles between all these scattered settlements to preach the gospel. My dad used a car instead of a horse, but for those 9 years of his ministry, he preached 3 times every Sunday morning. He'd start in Abbott, Maine, and then move to Sangerville, Maine, and then wind up in our hometown where our family lived of Monson, Maine, driving from church to church, preaching the same sermon 3 times every Sunday for those 9 years. And then over time, God really moved in those churches, 2 of them called full-time pastors. And in those early years, though, sparse numbers were the norm. That was the typical reality for him. The church in Abbott often had fewer than 10 people in attendance on Sunday mornings. And my dad tells the story from very early on. There's this one icy winter Sunday where only 2 older ladies, Opal and Ruby, came to church. They showed up by strapping on ice cleats and walking to the church. And when they got there, my dad asked whether they wanted to go ahead with the service. And they said yes. And so he preached a sermon, and he led the singing, and he gave the prayers, and he took the offering, and God was worshiped. He tells a whole bunch of stories from those early years of ministry. There's one time, this is one of the saddest, where he officiated a funeral service for a local woman, and not a single person attended that funeral service except for my dad and the funeral director. And as he spoke at that funeral, he grieved. He assumed that if no one showed up in her death to remember her, probably no one was visiting her in her final days. Long after one of those churches of the 3-church parish and then another had called its own full-time pastor, my dad continued to shepherd that tiny little church in our hometown. It never grew in numbers because the town was shrinking, and so the church stayed very small. And as he went to that one church, he became a bivocational pastor. He served in another ministry for many, many years, many of the years of my, as I was coming out of high school and then moving on. My dad was working bivocationally. I watched him finish well in pastoral ministry and hand off that pastorate to another younger pastor and then continue on, as he still does, in full-time vocational ministry, but not pastoral ministry of another sort. And I would say that like many other things about small town ministry, my own love for small places, the way I was nurtured in cultivating that love was really shaped by my dad's love for small places. It's complicated, though. It's not quite as simple as to say that because my dad loved his small place, I loved mine, although that's part of the reality. There are a couple things as I've thought about my dad's example, a couple things that I would really highlight as formative influences on me in terms of how I got to eventually, not initially, but eventually really have a heart for small town ministry. I think the first one I would highlight would be that my dad loved the periphery. God wires some people this way. He just cultivates in them a love for being out on the edge of things. Some people just naturally gravitate toward the center, and other people gravitate toward the periphery. I grew up reading Little House on the Prairie and hearing about Pa, Laura Ingalls' dad, who always loved to be out on the frontier. He was always restless. He always wanted to be moving to the next place. And I think in some ways, if my dad had been born 100 years earlier, he would have been like Pa. He would have been happiest away from the masses of humanity, out on the frontier, pushing westward. So in many ways, I think Dad was never going to aspire to city ministry. He read Jack London stories. He loved to travel. He spent some time as a young man in remote Alberta, Canada. He loved to hear the wolves howling in the distance. That was my dad. He really liked that idea of being out on the edge of things. And he and my mom honeymooned in Maine. They loved the cold, the snow, especially my dad. And my mom followed him in ministry into this place where none of the rest of our family had lived before. Now, of course, being out on the edge of things does come with some limitations and some drawbacks and some inconveniences. You know, Pa Ingalls had to build his own log cabin. His girl's idea of a good time was playing catch with an inflated pig's bladder. So there are things that are maybe not always as easy or as convenient when you're out on the periphery, especially when you're doing ministry in places like that. And many of you know that when you're doing ministry in small towns and in really rural settings, sometimes that comes with a small budget or very low attendance. And sometimes it's really, really difficult to maintain the life of your congregation. One of the most trying of my dad's responsibilities during that early period of his ministry was producing the Sunday bulletins. There wasn't any secretary to do it, and laser printers and copiers had not been invented yet. And so every Friday afternoon, he would descend to our dank, dark basement and do battle with this old mimeograph machine, kind of a decrepit machine sitting on our tool bench. And time after time, he tells me, he would lose his temper with that awful machine. The way he tells it now, by the time he finally emerged from the basement with those bulletins clutched in his hand, he would feel like he had totally blown it, lost his temper. He wasn't worthy to preach the gospel sermon he was preparing to preach on that Sunday. But that was kind of one of the realities of the sort of ministry he did. Of course, also there were far greater discouragements than recalcitrant mimeograph machines. And as my brothers and I grew up, we would, in some ways we were shielded by my parents from the travails of ministry, but we also would see things like we'd see the costliness of my dad's taking stands to say the right thing and do the right thing in gospel ministry. We'd see my parents' excitement when a new family came to church, which was not really all that often, and then their discouragement sometimes when that family would leave. And, the budgets were tight and volunteers were few, and sometimes parishioners would opt for larger churches in the area with more to offer. And we could see the weariness, sometimes the pain of ministry on the periphery. Thankfully, though, one of the other things we saw is that ministry on the periphery does not need to be peripheral ministry. And my dad, I just saw him time and again go after the heart of things and immerse himself in the life of our town. He worked really hard. I remember lying in bed on cold winter nights and hearing the door close behind him as he came back into the house after having been out late at a meeting. He rode along on late night patrols with his state trooper friend, and he knew school officials and business owners and town leaders. He prayed at town meetings. He participated in the local civic association. He chaired the committee when our town celebrated its 175th anniversary. And for years, he sent a quarterly newsletter from our church to every resident of our local communities. I think back on that, I realized, there wouldn't be any comparable influence that a pastor in Boston or Chicago or New York City would have, comparable to my dad's influence in our town and those surrounding communities. Maybe some of my dad's love for the periphery stemmed from reading Jack London and from just the natural wiring of his temperament. But I actually don't think that's the main reason he was drawn to the periphery, because if that was it, he wouldn't have lasted for 30 plus years in pastoral ministry. I think really at the core of that love for the periphery was a love for peripheral people. And that's really the second thing. As I think about my own journey to rural ministry and my dad's influence on me, I think not just about his love for the periphery, but his love for people. My mom and dad, as long as I can remember, have been drawn toward the weak and needy. So every Monday night for many years, we would share our dinner table with an old, unkempt bachelor who would eat his dinner in great noisy gulps. That was the kind of person my dad and my mom loved to welcome into our home. We'd often share Thanksgiving dinners with people who had nowhere else to go. Widows who lived nearby were usually the first stop when we went Christmas caroling with the church. Some of those widows were cared for by my parents year-round, often in costly ways, difficult, time-consuming ways. In fact, as a boy, it often seemed to me as though my dad's biggest fans were the older ladies in our church. And that wasn't because my dad was incredibly good-looking. It was because he looked at them, he saw them, he noticed them, he cared for them. And they responded to that so beautifully. He asked questions. He took interest in their stories. I would say, thinking back to my home church growing up, that church incorporated a fair share of misfits and some people who didn't smell very pleasant or look very impressive or sound all that educated or sing all that well. And that was honoring to Christ. That was largely because my mom and dad were drawn not just to the periphery, but to peripheral people. One of the rituals that my brothers and I sometimes enacted with our dad sort of stands out as emblematic of his approach toward ordinary and unimpressive people. He loved the outdoors. He loved going on Sunday afternoon walks on this hill, Homer Hill, overlooking our small town. And as my brothers and I got old enough, he would take us along with him. And sometimes he would get down on his belly on the ground, maybe near a tree somewhere, and he'd invite us to join him on the ground. And then he'd peel back the grass, and he'd maybe take a little stick and he'd dig a hole in the earth, and then he'd put his nose down into that hole and smell it and invite us to smell it. And then he'd say, and we knew by this time it was coming because he'd done this before, he'd say, "Hey boys, it might well be that no one has ever studied, ever smelled, ever examined this patch of earth in the history of the world." And I think about him doing that, and I think there's something emblematic about that, looking deeply, peering beneath appearances, looking to see something that's wondrous in the ordinary. That's a picture of what motivated him, what sustained him in ministry to ordinary people, forgotten people in an ordinary, forgotten place. I would say, though, the driving core center of my parents' motivation for the kind of ministry they did was the gospel. And love for the gospel was renewed morning by morning in our family devotions around the breakfast table. I saw my mom and dad regularly reading the Bible on their own and praying to God on their own. So those rhythms of family times in the Bible and personal times in the Bible were stoking and fueling and renewing a personal relationship with the Lord Jesus, who cares for ordinary, forgettable people, just like I am and my dad was, and the people to whom my dad and mom were ministering were. And though I didn't really fully comprehend it at the time, I think just being in my parents' home and observing the rhythms of their life and the impulses of their hearts was creating in me instincts that would lie dormant, almost like a time capsule that was buried for many years, and then come back into life, spring back into life when, to my surprise, I was called to my small place about 12 and a half years ago. Now, as I said, it's not just a straight line for me. There's some pain and some twists and turns in this story, because for many years, as I was getting toward the end of high school and then moving off to college, I decided, although I admired my dad's ministry, it'd be better for me, because I had some ambition and some deep pride that the Lord's needed to work on. It'd be better for me to go to a big city far away from where I'd grown up, and that became my version of success. And I've told some of that story in my book, A Big Gospel in Small Places. The Lord, over time, began to help me to recover some of those things I had learned from my dad and from my mom in those early years. Things like valuing what God gives us to do, treasuring what is small and unimpressive and forgotten by worldly standards. And so here's where I want to land this personal testimony about my own growth into not just a begrudging recognition of the importance of small town ministry, but a deep appreciation for it and a calling to it. I've come to see that often we learn to love things from the people we love. And I can think of, many examples of that in my own life. I love hard pretzels because my grandfather loves hard pretzels. I love to read because my mom loved to read, and she read out loud to my brothers and me. We learn to love things from people we love. And that's a huge part of my testimony of coming to love small town ministry and being called to it. I love forgotten people and forgotten places, largely because I lived in a house with two people who did. Two people who valued God's calling upon them so highly. And I learned to love because people I loved and people who loved me lived it out. I'm grateful for it. Pray God's encouragement upon you as you serve in the place He's called you to.